At first, it seemed like just another cold wind coming from the east. The soldiers of the 7th Panzer Division, their gray wool uniforms still crisp from the summer campaigns, laughed as they tugged at thin jacket collars, convinced that this icy breeze wouldn't stop Hitler's invincible machine. 80 kilometers from Moscow, November 15th, 1941. The air tasted of coming victory, of vodka celebrations, of triumph that felt close enough to touch. Sergeant Klaus Hartmann watched his men march with the confidence of conquerors. 34 years old, a veteran of Poland and France, he learned to trust his instincts over the years. Something about this Russian expanse unsettled him in ways the French countryside never had. The horizon stretched too far. The silence between the wind gusts felt too heavy. But orders were orders, and Moscow waited just beyond that white curtain beginning to gather in the eastern sky. Beside him, Peter Müller practically bounced with each step. 18 years old and fresh from Hamburg, his rifle slung over his shoulder like a tourist's walking stick. The boy had joined them 3 weeks ago, eyes wide with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from never having seen a friend die. Hartmann had assigned himself the silent duty of keeping the kid alive, though he'd never said it aloud. Some promises were better left unspoken. The first snowflakes appeared without ceremony, drifting down like ash from a distant fire. Men reached out bare hands to catch them, watching ice crystals melt against skin still warm from the morning's march. Nothing much, just weather. The kind of light dusting that reminded Hartmann of Berlin in early December, when his son would press his face against cold windows, waiting for enough accumulation to build a snowman. Peter caught a flake on his tongue, grinning. "Klaus, look at this. I've never seen snow this early. Is it always like this in Russia?" Hartmann didn't answer immediately. The sky had shifted from pale blue to something heavier, a gray blanket descending like a curtain on the final act of a play no one had rehearsed. He'd seen strange weather before, but this felt different. The air pressure changed, his ears popped. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out once and went silent. The snow fell and didn't stop. Within an hour, the dirt roads that had carried them across half a continent began to disappear beneath accumulating white. Truck tires churned through mud that quickly hardened, each rotation becoming more labored than the last. The wind picked up, not howling yet, but building towards something, a low whistle that sounded almost like voices hidden in the gray distance. By midday, the advance had slowed to half speed. Boots sank into snow that reached past ankles, then climbed towards shins. Each step required lifting, planting, lifting again, a rhythm that transformed marching into a kind of vertical swimming. Men who'd crossed entire countries in weeks now measured progress in meters. The officers consulted maps that showed roads and landmarks, all of which had vanished beneath the white carpet. Lieutenant Schaefer shouted orders over the wind, his voice carrying less authority than usual, as if he too sensed something fundamental shifting in the air around them. "We're still on schedule. Moscow falls within the month. This snow is nothing. Keep moving." But the engines disagreed. The first Opel Blitz truck coughed to silence just after noon, steam rising from its hood like a dying breath. The driver, a thick-necked man from Bavaria named Werner, cranked the ignition again and again, each attempt weaker than the last. Nothing. The diesel had begun to thicken in the cold, turning from liquid to something closer to paste, choking the fuel lines with viscous sludge. Other drivers gathered around, offering advice that ranged from practical to desperate. Try heating the block. Pour hot water over the engine. Light a fire underneath. They tried everything, improvising with matches and scraps of newspaper, blowing hot breath into frozen mechanisms, as if warmth from human lungs could resurrect metal and oil. Some engines restarted, running rough but running. Others remained silent, dead mechanical corpses that would have to be abandoned or towed. The convoy that had moved with precision now stretched and fragmented, gaps appearing between units like missing teeth in a boxer's smile. Temperature at sunset, minus 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough to sting exposed skin, not cold enough yet to kill. Hartmann gathered his unit as darkness fell, counting faces in the dim light. 64 men under his direct command, most of them still operational, still believing they'd be warming themselves in Moscow by Christmas. He said nothing to dampen their optimism. Let them keep their hope while they still could. That night they slept in a commandeered barn, bodies pressed together for warmth, the smell of unwashed men in damp wool filling the air. Peter curled against Hartmann's side like a child seeking protection from nightmares, and Hartmann didn't push him away. The boy mumbled in his sleep, something about a girl named Greta back in Hamburg, something about promises made before deployment. Outside, the snow continued its patient work. November 16th dawned gray and bitter. The accumulation had reached past mid-calf, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. Rivers and roads looked identical under their white shrouds. Fences that once marked property boundaries jutted up at odd angles. Half-buried sentinels of a world that existed before winter decided to assert its dominance. The march resumed, slower now, men leaning into wind that cut through wool uniforms as if the fabric offered no more resistance than paper. Hartmann noticed the first signs of frostbite appearing on exposed faces, noses going white then red, then an alarming purple that spoke of tissue damage happening in real time. The Panzer tanks, those magnificent machines that had crushed Polish resistance and overwhelmed French defenses, began to show signs of distress. Oil viscosity changed in the extreme cold, internal mechanisms grinding where they should have flowed smoothly. Tank commanders reported sluggish response times, engines that took multiple attempts to start, turrets that rotated like arthritic shoulders. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, commander of a Panzer IV he'd named Brunhilde after his 8-year-old daughter, stood atop his tank watching the morning formation with growing unease. 39 years old, a professional soldier who'd served in the Reichswehr before the war, he understood mechanical systems the way some men understood music. These sounds his tank made were wrong. The harmonics were off. Something fundamental was changing in the relationship between metal and cold. His crew gathered below, 5 men who'd fought together since France, their faces showing the first traces of doubt. The loader, Otto, stamped his feet against the cold, breath coming in visible clouds that froze in his mustache. Hauptmann, the oil pressure is fluctuating. Temperature gauge shows the coolant barely circulating. Weber nodded, making notes in the log he kept meticulously, documenting every mechanical hiccup for future reference. Assuming there was a future where such documentation mattered, we'll monitor it, keep the engine warm whenever we stop. We faced worse, but they hadn't, and Weber knew it, though he wouldn't say it aloud. Command authority required projecting confidence even when doubt gnawed at your spine. November 18th brought the first confirmed death from exposure. A private from the 106th Infantry Division, a 20-year-old from Munich who'd complained of numbness in his extremities, simply failed to wake up. His tent mates found him in the morning, sitting upright with his back against a tree, eyes open and glazed with frost, fingers locked around a photograph of a woman no one recognized. The news spread through the ranks like illness, a quiet pandemic of realization. The cold could kill, not just wound, not just inconvenience, but actually terminate life as efficiently as any bullet. Men began checking their hands obsessively, rubbing them together, blowing hot breath onto numbed fingers, watching for the telltale white patches that preceded tissue death. By November 20th, the 7th Panzer Division had lost 38 vehicles to mechanical failure. Tanks sat abandoned along the route of march, their crews redistributed to other units or forced to continue on foot. The mighty armored spearhead that was supposed to pierce Moscow's defenses now looked more like a wounded animal dragging itself forward through hostile terrain. Hartmann noticed Peter's hands had started going numb during night watch. The boy flexed his fingers constantly, trying to maintain circulation, but the cold stole warmth faster than metabolism could generate it. Small cuts on his knuckles refused to heal, scabbing over, then cracking open again each time he bent his fingers. "Keep them moving," Hartmann told him, demonstrating the circular motion that helped maintain blood flow. "Don't let them go still. Movement is life out here." Peter nodded, face pinched with cold and something else, something that looked like the first stirrings of real fear. "Sergeant, how much longer until Moscow?" Hartmann looked at the white expanse ahead, landmarks erased, distances impossible to judge. "Could be days, could be weeks. High command says we're on schedule." "But you don't believe that," Peter said, not quite a question. Hartmann chose his words carefully. I believe we'll get where we're going. Question is what condition we'll be in when we arrive. The wind answered for him, rising to a shriek that drowned out further conversation. November 22nd arrived with unexpected activity. Word spread through the column that a supply convoy was approaching, trucks loaded with winter equipment finally released from depots in the rear. Officers announced it with barely concealed relief, as if the appearance of proper logistics would solve all the problems accumulating like snow on dead branches. Morale lifted instantly. Men who'd been trudging in silence began talking again, making jokes, planning what they'd do with actual winter coats and insulated boots. Maybe High Command hadn't forgotten them after all. Maybe someone back in the warm offices of Rastenburg actually understood what conditions were like out here. Hartmann wanted to believe it. Watching his men's faces brighten, seeing Peter's grin return, he wanted desperately to trust that proper equipment would arrive and everything would proceed according to plan. But 34 years of life had taught him to temper hope with skepticism, especially where military bureaucracy was involved. The convoy appeared just after noon, 15 trucks grinding through snow that now stood knee-high in the deeper drifts. Men rushed forward, eager to unload the salvation that would make this Russian winter bearable. Officers organized distribution, counting heads, calculating allocation. Temperature hovered at -15 Celsius, cold enough that the metal truck beds burned bare skin on contact. The first crate opened to reveal uniforms. Summer weight uniforms. Gray wool designed for French weather, not Russian winter. No insulation, no inner lining. Just standard issue garrison dress that would provide approximately zero additional protection against temperatures dropping 30 degrees below freezing. The second crate held blankets. Thin cotton blankets. The kind you'd use in a heated barracks in October, utterly inadequate for sleeping in snow. Some men pulled them out anyway, wrapping the useless fabric around their shoulders, more from desperation than actual hope of warmth. The third crate contained boots. Not the felt-lined winter boots they'd prayed for, but regular marching boots with leather that would stiffen in extreme cold and conduct freezing temperatures directly to the feet. A handful of men tried them on anyway, discovering their regular boots had already deteriorated to the point where even inadequate replacements seemed like improvement. Lieutenant Schaefer stood by the trucks, face cycling through confusion, anger, and finally resignation. These supplies were meant for France. Some administrative mix-up. They'll send the correct equipment. When? Someone shouted from the crowd. Schaefer had no answer. Soon. It has to be soon. Peter turned to Hartmann, and the question came unbidden, too raw to filter through military decorum. Sergeant, are we going to die here? Hartmann met the boy's eyes, saw 18 years of life compressed into a single moment of crystalline understanding. The lie came automatically, smoothly, a mercy more than a deception. No, kid, we'll be fine. High Command knows what we need. The right supplies will come. Inside, a different voice spoke, cold and certain as the wind. They forgot about us. They have no idea what we're facing. And by the time they figure it out, it might be too late. Temperature at sunset November 22nd, -18 Celsius and still dropping. The body's protest began quietly, insidiously, with sensations so subtle they could be mistaken for tiredness or poor circulation. Fingers that tingled during morning formation, toes that ached during the midday march, patches of skin that went numb and then screamed back to life when pressed against something warm. Hartmann watched it spread through his unit like a slow-motion plague. First the extremities, always the extremities, evolution having decided that fingers and toes were acceptable sacrifices to preserve the core. Men's hands began to swell, knuckles disappearing under puffy inflammation that made gripping a rifle difficult. Noses turned colors that belonged in an artist's palette, white fading to purple fading to black. The progression followed a predictable pattern. Tingling gave way to numbness. Numbness gave way to pain, an incandescent burning that felt like touching fire while being frozen solid. Pain gave way to terrible silence, the moment when nerve endings stopped sending signals because there was nothing left to signal from. Dead tissue didn't hurt. That's when you knew you'd crossed from injury into amputation. By November 24th, the medical tents reported 156 cases of second-degree frostbite in the 106th Infantry Division alone. Field doctors, overwhelmed and undersupplied, did what they could with limited resources. Amputations performed with instruments that had to be heated between procedures to prevent them from freezing to damage flesh. Dr. Wilhelm Becker, 45 years old and a practicing physician for 2 decades before the war, stood in his surgical tent looking at hands he could no longer save. Black fingertips, purple palms, tissue that had crystallized and died while the soldier slept. There was no bringing it back. You could no more resurrect frozen flesh than you could unbreak an egg. "I'm amputating more than treating," he muttered to his assistant, a young medic who'd gone pale watching the procedure. "This isn't medicine. This is butchery." But he kept cutting, because leaving dead tissue attached meant gangrene, and gangrene meant death. Better a living soldier with missing fingers than a dead one with all 10 intact. The logistics system, that magnificent German organizational machine that had fed and moved millions of men across half of Europe, began to fragment under the strain. 3 separate systems had to align perfectly for the Wehrmacht to function: rail, road, and animal transport. All 3 were failing simultaneously. The railroad problem was fundamental and unfixable. Russian rail gauge measured 89 millimeters wider than European standard. Every kilometer of advance required conversion, rails ripped up and relayed, work that demanded precision and time, and tools that cooperated with their users. At minus 20 degrees, metal tools stuck to bare hands like magnets, tearing skin away when pulled free. Engineers worked with wrapped handles and thick gloves, efficiency dropping to a fraction of normal speed. Many collapsed from exhaustion and cold, coughing blood in the morning from lungs damaged by breathing frozen air, shivering through nights that offered no real rest. Some died at their posts, found in the morning with tools still frozen to their hands, dead eyes staring at rail conversion that would never be completed. The trains that managed to move forward often stopped in the middle of nowhere, tracks twisted by thermal contraction, switches frozen in position, signals dark and unresponsive. Wagons full of ammunition and food sat stranded, supplies visible but unreachable, taunting the starving men just kilometers away. Road transport fared no better. The Opel Blitz trucks, workhorses of the German supply system, died in droves. Gasoline thickened into sludge. Rubber lost its flexibility, tires cracking and bursting like overripe fruit. Radiators froze despite antifreeze, the liquid reaching its thermal limit and surrendering to physics. Drivers attempted desperate remedies, building fires under engine blocks, pouring precious drinking water over frozen components, sacrificing blankets as insulation for mechanical systems. Nothing worked for long. Metal contracted, seals failed, gaskets split. Modern machinery revealed itself to be a fair-weather friend, impressive in ideal conditions, but helpless in the face of Russian winter. But the true tragedy played out on 4 legs. Horses. Half the German logistics network still depended on them, animals doing the unglamorous work of hauling artillery and supplies where trucks couldn't venture. They'd been bred for European climates, German farms, and Polish fields. Not for the deep cold of continental Russia. They began dying on November 26th. The first sign was subtle, a reluctance to move that could be mistaken for stubbornness. Then the shivering started, violent tremors that shook their entire bodies, muscles burning through fat reserves trying to generate heat that dissipated into the frozen air faster than metabolism could produce it. Ribs became visible through thinning hides. Eyes went dull and resigned. Some fell to their knees during the march and never rose. Others died during the night, curled in the snow, breath coming in labored gasps until it stopped coming at all. By morning, they'd become frozen sculptures, grotesque monuments to the hubris of invading Russia without winter preparation. The surviving horses were skeletal, bones pressing against skin, hooves cracking with each step. Artillery crews watched their animals waste away and knew what it meant. No horses meant no mobile guns. No mobile guns meant no fire support. No fire support meant infantry facing Soviet positions without covering bombardment. Soldiers who'd never wept over human casualties found themselves crying over horses, not from sentiment, but from recognition. The animals were dying of the same thing killing them, just faster, with less ability to rationalize or deceive themselves about the severity of their situation. Hans Dietrich, 25 years old, from Berlin, with a 3-year-old daughter named Sophie waiting at home, watched his battery's lead horse die on the morning of November 27. The animal had pulled their howitzer since Poland, a massive Belgian draft horse that had survived 2 years of war, only to succumb to simple cold. Hans knelt beside it, hand on its neck, feeling the final tremors, and wondered if this was how his own death would come. Quiet, inevitable, meaningless. Food became the new obsession, displacing even thoughts of Moscow or victory. Rations had been cut once, then again, then a third time, each reduction accompanied by promises that resupply was imminent. The promises stopped being credible after the second week. The standard Kommissbrot, that dense black bread that sustained German armies, arrived frozen solid, hard as masonry, requiring axes to break into portions. Men discovered that warming it over fires burned the exterior while leaving the interior frozen, creating a charged shell around an icy core. Some broke teeth trying to bite through it. Others gave up and sucked on chunks like hard candy, waiting for saliva to dissolve enough to swallow. Canned meat became a cruel joke. Schweinefleisch, pork that should have been easy protein, froze into blocks that required wire saws to portion. Heating it over fires produced an aroma that tortured hungry men, the smell of cooking meat amplifying their starvation rather than satisfying it. Rations that should have lasted 2 days were consumed in 1, bodies burning through calories trying to generate heat, hunger driving men to eat faster than discipline could restrain them. Water presented its own challenge. Canteens froze solid overnight, becoming useless lumps of ice with handles. Melting snow was the only option, a process that took hours over small fires to produce enough liquid to wet your throat. Drinking unmelted snow, despite doctors' warnings, became common. Each swallowed handful lowered core temperature, stealing heat from inside to melt the ice. But thirst overrode caution. Some men developed bloody stools from consuming too much frozen precipitation, intestinal linings damaged by the temperature shock. Others just accepted the trade, warmth for hydration, knowing both were necessary and neither was adequately available. By November 28th, the 7th Panzer Division was operating at 62% combat effectiveness, a number that looked reasonable on paper, but translated to cold reality as dead men frozen in their positions, vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel or crew, and soldiers too weakened by hunger and cold to perform basic military functions. That evening, as darkness fell and temperatures plunged toward -25°C, Hartmann gathered 5 men around a fire barely larger than a helmet, himself, Peter, and 3 others he'd been watching develop into something like a family unit through the shared misery. Hans, the Berliner with the daughter. Friedrich, 32, a farmer from Bavaria who talked constantly about his wheat fields. Kurt, 19, a philosophy student from Heidelberg who'd been asking questions about life's meaning since they crossed into Russia. Someone produced a cigarette, the last one in the entire unit, a crumpled treasure more valuable than money, more desired than a hot meal. Hans held it up in the firelight, a small white cylinder representing normalcy, peacetime, the world they'd left behind. "We share it," he said, not quite a question. No one disagreed. The cigarette made its circuit, each man taking a single drag, holding the smoke in his lungs longer than usual, reluctant to exhale the brief warmth. Peter took his turn with shaking hands, the numb fingers, nearly dropping it before passing to Hartmann. Hans broke the silence first, his voice carrying the peculiar intimacy that comes from men facing death together. "Sophie will be 4 in January. I promised to bring her a Russian doll, the kind with the smaller dolls inside. What are they called?" "Matryoshka," Friedrich offered, surprising everyone with his knowledge. "That's it. Matryoshka. She'll love it." He stared into the fire, seeing something none of the others could. "I was going to teach her to read this year. She knows her alphabet already, smart as anything." Friedrich picked up the thread. grateful to talk about anything except their current reality. I should be harvesting now. Late harvest, but the wheat would be ready. Instead, I'm freezing in Russia. He laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. My father always said I had no sense. Guess he was right. Kurt, the philosophy student, contributed his piece with the earnestness only a 19-year-old can muster. I was studying what gives life meaning, examined all the great thinkers, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche. You know what I learned out here? Life's meaning is staying warm. Everything else is commentary. The others smiled despite themselves. From great philosophy to small truths, that was the arc of education in winter Russia. Peter spoke last, his voice cracking slightly. Her name is Greta. We've been writing since I deployed. I was going to propose when I got back. Had the ring made before we left. It's in my pack. He touched his chest as if feeling the ring through layers of wool. Stupid to carry it here. Should have left it home. But I wanted it close. Hartmann said nothing, just listened, because that's what the moment required. These boys needed to speak their lives into existence, to remind themselves and each other that they were more than frozen soldiers in a losing campaign. They were sons and lovers and men with futures that might still exist if they could just survive long enough to return. Someone started humming, low and uncertain. The tune caught, spreading between them, until all five were singing quietly. Lily Marlene, the song every German soldier knew, the anthem of longing and distance, of lovers separated by war and time. Their voices carried across the snow, ragged and off-key but sincere. In the distance, perhaps 200 meters away, Soviet sentries heard the singing and paused. Later, one would write in his diary about the strange experience of hearing the enemy sing love songs in the darkness, voices full of the same yearning Soviet soldiers felt. For a moment, the war disappeared, replaced by shared human loneliness. Then the wind rose and carried the music away. The fire burned lower. Hans made them promise. If I don't make it, will someone tell Sophie about me? Tell her Papa loved her. Tell her I tried to come home. Everyone promised. We all make it, or none of us do, Friedrich said, the words becoming a pact between them. Hartmann added his piece, the command that felt more like prayer. You'll tell her yourself, Hans. That's an order. They slept pressed together, 5 bodies sharing warmth that none possessed individually, and for a few hours the cold retreated enough to allow unconsciousness. Morning revealed the cost. Hans lay still against the pine tree they'd used as a windbreak, rifle between his knees, a photograph of Sophie clutched in his frozen hand. Friedrich had curled into a fetal position during the night and never uncurled, his face peaceful, almost smiling, as if he'd died dreaming of wheat fields under warm sun. Kurt sat upright, a half-written letter to his philosophy professor on his lap, the final sentence ending mid-word where his hand had stopped working. Only Peter and Hartmann remained alive, and Peter barely, his lips blue and skin waxen, breathing so shallow it was almost undetectable. Hartmann shook him, first gently, then violently. Peter, wake up. You don't get to sleep. That's not allowed. You hear me? Stay awake. Peter's eyes opened, unfocused and distant. So tired. Just 5 minutes. Please, just 5 minutes. Hartmann slapped him, sharp and stinging, the crack echoing in the still morning air. No. Sleep is death out here. You sleep. You don't wake up. Look around. You see Hans, Friedrich, Kurt. They're gone. You stay awake or you join them. The cruelty in his voice was calculated, desperate, the only tool he had left. Peter's eyes focused, tears freezing on his cheeks as understanding arrived. The others are dead? Hartmann nodded, already going through their pockets, taking identification papers, gathering what little they had that might matter to families back home. Taking Hans's photo of Sophie, Friedrich's letters, Kurt's philosophy notes that would never become a thesis, small artifacts of extinguished lives. We need to move, he told Peter, voice gentler now. We stay here, we die here. Can you walk? Peter nodded. Though his movements were uncertain, limbs responding slowly to neural commands, Hartmann pulled him upright, steadied him, and together they left the bodies of their friends sitting in the snow, 3 frozen memorials to brotherhood and cold. November 29th arrived with a meteorological anomaly that felt like divine intervention. The temperature rose. Not dramatically, not warmth by any reasonable standard, but enough to notice. -8 degrees Celsius by mid-morning, the first time in a week the thermometer had climbed above -10. Men stopped marching to feel it, faces turned toward the sky like flowers seeking sun. The snow stopped falling. Actual light penetrated the cloud cover, pale and weak, but undeniably there. For the first time since mid-November, hope seemed justified by evidence rather than wishful thinking. Maybe the worst is over. The phrase spread through the ranks like gospel, each repetition adding conviction. Maybe this was just early winter, unusually harsh but temporary. Maybe Moscow was still achievable. Maybe Christmas at home was still possible. Officers cautiously shared the optimism, not willing to dampen morale that had been so scarce. Lieutenant Schaefer allowed himself a smile. Weather's turning. We push forward today, make up lost time. Some vehicles that had been stubbornly silent for days coughed to life, engines turning over with reluctant cooperation. Supply trucks moved again, forming convoys that looked almost orderly. The army remembered what it felt like to function as an army, rather than a mob of freezing refugees. Peter seemed to revive with the warmth, color returning to his face, movements becoming more coordinated. "See, Sergeant? We worried for nothing. It's warming up." "We'll be fine," Hartmann wanted to believe. The temptation to accept this reprieve as permanent was overwhelming, seductive in its simplicity. But something nagged at his instincts, a whisper of wrongness he couldn't quite articulate. During the midday break, he approached a Russian peasant who'd been watching the German column from a safe distance, an old woman wrapped in layers of wool and fur that spoke of generations living in this climate. Through a translator, a reluctant private who spoke basic Russian, Hartmann asked his question, "Will it stay warm?" The peasant woman studied him with eyes that had seen too many winters to count. She laughed, a sound without humor, and spoke words the translator struggled to render. "This is Eye of Storm. Real winter comes tonight." "How do you know?" Hartmann pressed. She gestured at the sky. "Too clear. The wind. Too quiet. Nature is gathering strength. You have perhaps until sunset. Then it comes. The real cold. Not like before. Worse." Hartmann thanked her, offered cigarettes she refused, and returned to his unit with new dread settling in his gut. He reported to Lieutenant Schaefer, who dismissed it immediately. "Superstitious peasant nonsense. Temperature is rising. Meteorological fact. You're spreading panic, Sergeant. Permission to prepare my unit anyway, sir." Schaefer waved him away, irritated. "Do what you want, but stop with the doomsaying." Hartmann gathered his remaining men, 23 now after losing Hans and Friedrich and Kurt, and too many others he'd stopped counting. He said nothing about peasant warnings or instinct. Just gave orders. Gather extra firewood. Double what you think you need. Sleep in groups, minimum 4 men. Share body heat. Eat all your rations tonight. Don't save anything. Peter questioned him privately. "Why so worried? It's warming up." "Everyone says so." Hartmann met his eyes, saw the hope there, and couldn't quite kill it. "Just do as I say, kid. Trust me." Sunset came early, as it does in late November at northern latitudes. The temperature had held steady at -8 degrees through the afternoon, maintaining the illusion of improvement. Men prepared for night watch with more confidence than they'd felt in days. Then the sky changed. The clear blue that had accompanied the warm spell darkened to heavy gray, that particular shade that speaks of vast weather systems moving into position. The wind, which had been quiet all day, began to pick up, first as a whisper, then a mutter, then a voice that built towards shouting. By 1800 hours, the temperature had dropped 4 degrees. By 1900, it was -15. By 2000, -18. The rate of decrease accelerated, temperature falling like a stone dropped down a well, plunging toward depths that shouldn't exist in inhabited parts of the world. The peasant's words echoed in Hartmann's mind. Real winter comes tonight. He'd never believed in prophecy, but he believed in experience, And that old woman had survived decades in this land that was actively trying to kill him. She knew something he didn't, something his training and his equipment and his military doctrine had failed to prepare him for. 2,100 hours, minus 24 degrees Celsius. Men huddled around fires that struggled to stay lit, wind stealing heat faster than wood could generate it. The cold pressed down like a physical weight, squeezing the warmth from bodies, forcing its way through every gap in inadequate clothing. 2,200 hours, minus 30 degrees. Fires guttered and died. Relighting them became impossible. Matches freezing in their boxes, tinder too cold to catch. Men pressed together in desperate clusters, sharing what little warmth remained, knowing it wasn't enough, but having no other options. 2,300 hours, minus 35 degrees. The air itself became hostile, each breath a knife in the lungs, alveoli burning from the shock of frozen oxygen. Tears froze in their ducts. Eyelids stuck together. Blood slowed in veins and arteries, becoming sluggish, reluctant to flow. Midnight, November 30th, 1941. Minus 38 degrees Celsius. 4 hours from sunset, 26 degrees of temperature drop. Physics expressing itself through human suffering. The sounds of men dying filled the darkness. Not screaming, that came later. First came the quiet sounds, whimpering, praying, mumbling incoherently as consciousness slipped away. Some called for mothers, others for wives. A few just repeated the same word over and over, a lifeline to sanity that frayed with each repetition. Hartmann kept Peter close, arms wrapped around the boy, forcing his own body heat into keeping another human alive. He felt his own extremities going numb, fingers losing sensation, toes becoming distant abstractions he couldn't quite feel anymore. But Peter was still breathing, still conscious, still alive. That had to be enough. Stay with me, kid. Keep talking. Tell me about Greta. What's she like? Peter's voice came weak and slurred, hypothermia stealing coherence along with warmth. She has brown hair, loves to dance, laughs at my jokes even when they're not funny. I was going to take her to the Baltic in summer. She's never seen the ocean. Keep talking. What else? She wants 3 children, a house with a garden. She works in a bakery, comes home smelling like bread. I can smell it when I close my eyes. Warm bread. Can you smell it? Hartmann couldn't smell anything except cold and death and his own fear, but he lied. Yes, I can smell it. Hold on to that. Think about warm bread in summer and your wedding. Don't think about now. Think about then. Peter went quiet and Hartmann shook him hard. Don't sleep. You hear me? You sleep, you die. Stay awake. I'm so tired, Sergeant. I know. Me too. But we don't get to rest yet. Not here. Not now. You promised to tell Greta about the war. Can't do that if you're dead. So stay awake. The night stretched like torture, seconds moving like hours. Each minute a battle against biology and physics, and the universe's fundamental indifference to human survival. Around them, other clusters of men grew quiet, one by one, voices trailing off mid-sentence or mid-prayer. Dawn, when it finally came, arrived without sun, just a gradual graying of the eastern sky, light seeping into darkness with reluctant inevitability. Hartmann opened his eyes, eyelashes crackling with frost, and saw the landscape transformed into a nightmare of white and black and red. Bodies everywhere, sitting, standing, lying curled. Frozen in the exact positions of their final moments, one with hand outstretched, another face down, a third on his back, arms spread wide like an inverted crucifix. The snow had drifted around them during the night, creating gentle mounds that almost looked like natural features of the terrain until you looked closer and saw the human shape beneath. Hartmann counted his unit, started with 23 men last night. 14 remained alive this morning, 9 dead in 8 hours. 39% casualties from cold alone. No enemy contact, no combat, just weather expressing its dominion over human ambition. Peter stirred against him, alive, conscious, miraculously intact. We made it? Hartmann nodded, not trusting his voice yet. We made it. The sergeant stood on numb legs, looking across the devastation. Other units had suffered similarly or worse. The 23rd Infantry Division, camped half a kilometer away, showed even more carnage. Bodies clustered around dead fires, men who'd frozen trying to warm themselves, ice claiming them despite their desperate efforts. Lieutenant Schaefer emerged from his shelter, face shocked into vacancy, unable to process the scale of loss. He approached Hartmann, and for the first time in his career, the officer looked uncertain, command authority cracking under the weight of circumstances beyond his training. Sergeant, what do we do? Hartmann had no answer that would help, but he offered what he could. We count the living, bury the dead if the ground allows. And we keep moving, because stopping means joining them. In the distance, through the morning mist, movement caught Hartmann's eye. White shapes against white background, gliding across the snow with impossible speed. Silent, efficient, deadly. Soviet ski troops. The enemy had arrived and the Germans could barely stand, much less fight. The two-pronged assault had begun. Cold from above, Russians from ahead, and the Wehrmacht caught between like a nut in a vise, pressure building from both sides. Hartmann pulled Peter close, his voice low and urgent. They're here, and we can't even stand up to fight. The white abyss had opened its mouth. The Wehrmacht was falling in. December 5th dawned without sun, only a dirty gray light filtering through clouds that hung low enough to touch. The temperature had stabilized at minus 48 degrees Celsius near Klin, the coldest reading anyone could remember. Thermometers struggling to register numbers that belonged in Siberian wastes, not battlefields 80 kilometers from Moscow. The air possessed weight, a physical presence that pressed down on everything, transforming simple breathing into labor. The panzer divisions arrived at the front like wounded giants, their approach announced by the grinding of tracks that should have roared, but instead whined with mechanical distress. These were the machines that had swept across Europe, the armored fist of blitzkrieg doctrine, symbols of German technological superiority and tactical innovation. Now they crawled forward hesitantly, metal bodies betraying the flesh inside. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood beside his Panzer IV, watching engine steam dissipate into frozen air. Brunhilde had carried him from France to the gates of Moscow, her diesel heart beating strong through every engagement, every advance, every victory that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. This morning she refused to start. The oil had transformed overnight from liquid to paste, a yellowish sludge that couldn't lubricate, couldn't flow, couldn't perform the basic function that kept metal from grinding against metal. His crew had tried everything, heating the block with fires built underneath, pouring precious drinking water over frozen components, even urinating on the engine housing, desperation overcoming dignity in the futile hope that body temperature liquid might restore function. Nothing worked. Brunhilde sat silent, her 50-millimeter gun pointing accusingly at the gray horizon, impotent steel that might as well have been a monument for all the tactical value it offered. Weber's crew gathered around him, 5 men who'd fought together since the breakthrough at Sedan, faces showing the erosion that cold and fear and exhaustion carve into human features. His gunner, a precise man from Munich named Dieter, spoke first. Hauptmann, radiator froze and cracked during the night. Coolant's gone. Even if we get her started, she'll overheat and seize. The loader, Otto, 35 years old with a wife and bakery waiting in Munich, stamped feet against cold that penetrated felt boots as if the insulation were imaginary. Engine block might be cracked too. Heard it groaning around 0300. Metal contracting. The tolerances are shot. Weber made notes in his log documenting mechanical failure with the thoroughness of a man who still believed documentation mattered, who still operated as if there would be a future where these details could inform better engineering, improved design, lessons learned for next time. Assuming there was a next time. The driver, Klaus, 22 with a daughter he'd never met, born 3 weeks after deployment, finally voiced what everyone thought. Sir, with respect, this tank is dead. We're not. Weber looked at Brunhilde, his hand resting on armor that conducted cold like a promise of death. I know we should abandon her, Klaus continued, emboldened by necessity. Find shelter, join an infantry unit. Something. The other crew members nodded, a silent vote on survival versus duty, pragmatism versus principle. Weber understood their logic. Staying with a dead tank in minus 48-degree weather violated every survival instinct evolution had programmed into the human brain. But he'd commanded this machine for 2 years, had named her after his daughter, had lived inside her steel skin through Poland and France and the endless Russian steppe. You didn't just walk away from that kind of relationship, even when rationality demanded it. This tank came with me from the beginning, he told them, voice steady despite the screaming internal conflict. I won't abandon her like garbage on the roadside. Hauptmann, Dieter pressed, we're going to die in here. The temperature's still dropping. No engine means no heat. We freeze in 12 hours, maybe less. Then you have a choice to make. Weber met each man's eyes in turn. I'm staying. Brunhilde is my responsibility, my command. I don't leave my post, but you can. That's not desertion, that's survival. I won't judge you for it. The crew looked at each other, having the conversation without words that men who've lived in close quarters develop. Klaus spoke for the group. I have a daughter I've never held. I want to live long enough to meet her. Then go, Weber told him, the permission genuine, free of resentment. Live. Tell them Brunhilde fought until the end. Tell them her crew did their duty. I'm staying, Otto announced, surprising everyone, including himself. Someone should keep you company, Hauptmann. Not right, you dying alone. Weber gripped his shoulder, gratitude too large for words. The others gathered personal items, photographs and letters and small talismans they'd accumulated, preparing to abandon the tank that had been their home and fortress. Klaus approached Weber last, holding out a photograph. My daughter. Her name is Anna. If you survive somehow and I don't, tell her about me. Weber took the photo, a newborn's face creased and alien in the way of all infants, and nodded. I will. Now go. That's an order. They left at 0800, 3 figures trudging through snow toward a cluster of buildings that might offer shelter, might offer warmth, might offer continued existence. Weber and Otto watched until they disappeared into the white, then climbed back inside Brunhilde's frozen interior. The tank, designed to be cramped with 5 men, felt cavernous with 2. Every surface radiated cold, metal conducting away what little warmth their bodies produced. Sitting on the hull was like pressing against ice. Touching anything with bare skin meant leaving flesh behind. The interior had become a crypt, waiting patiently for its occupants to become its permanent residents. Otto tried to make a fire using torn notebook pages and diesel fuel, the small flame providing brief psychological comfort, if not actual warmth. Carbon monoxide built up quickly in the enclosed space, forcing them to crack the hatch, which let in wind that killed the fire and stole the heat faster than it had accumulated. We're going to die, aren't we? Otto asked, not seeking reassurance, just stating probability. Weber considered lying, but decided truth was the only currency worth trading when time ran short. Yes, probably. Unless the temperature rises or relief arrives, neither seems likely. Otto nodded, accepting it the way you accept any inevitable thing once pretense becomes too exhausting to maintain. Then we should talk. Pass the time. Tell me about your daughter, the real one. Weber pulled out a photograph worn soft from handling, an 8-year-old girl with his eyes and her mother's smile, standing in their garden in Stuttgart. Brunhilde, she's curious about everything, asks questions I can't answer. Why is the sky blue? Where do stars come from? What happens when we die? He paused, that last question suddenly resonant. I used to make up answers. Now I think honesty would have been better. She knows you love her, Otto offered. That matters more than answers. Does it? Weber stared at the photo, trying to imprint every detail in memory, as if concentration could preserve what cold would erase. I left her to fight this war. That's the truth. Chose duty over her. What does that say about my love? Otto had no answer, so he shared his own burden instead. My wife writes me letters, 3 a week. She describes the bakery, the customers, small events that mean nothing and everything. Yesterday, someone bought 6 rolls. The cat caught a mouse, rain in the morning, sun by afternoon. He closed his eyes, seeing it. I'll never make bread with her again. Never smell yeast rising. Never wake up to her beside me. And the worst part? I can't even remember what she smells like. The memory's gone. They sat in silence, 2 men in a metal coffin, inventorying their losses while waiting for the final subtraction. December 6 brought no relief, no warming trend, no miraculous rescue. Otto died sometime during the night, hypothermia shutting down his systems while he slept. Core temperature dropping below the threshold where cellular function could continue. Weber woke to find him seated at his station. Head tilted back, mouth slightly open, eyes glazed with frost. Peaceful, almost serene, as if he'd simply decided to stop participating in the prolonged process of freezing. Weber checked for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there, found confirmation in dead flesh, and tried to feel something other than envy. Otto had escaped. The suffering was over for him. Weber remained alone with consciousness and cold, each minute stretching into eternity. He opened his journal, fingers barely able to grip the pen, and wrote, December 8, 1941, 1400 hours, temperature inside tank approximately minus 40 degrees. Otto died last night. Klaus and the others left 2 days ago. No idea if they survived. I am alone in Brunhilde. Just us now. The way it should be, perhaps. A captain doesn't abandon his ship. A commander doesn't abandon his tank. I thought about my daughter this morning, the real Brunhilde. 8 years old, smart, brave, everything I wish I could be. She'll grow up without me, learn to read, to write, to think, fall in love, maybe have children of her own. I'll miss all of it. This wasn't supposed to be how it ended. We were supposed to win, take Moscow, go home victorious. I believed that, believed in the mission, the cause, the promise that our sacrifice meant something. Now I see the truth. We came to conquer a continent that refuses to be conquered, not by us, not by anyone. Russia doesn't fight with guns and tanks. It fights with space and winter and patience. It just waits for invaders to die. Maybe that's justice. Maybe we deserve this. To my daughter, if anyone reads this, Papa is sorry. Sorry I left. Sorry I chose war over you. Sorry I won't see you grow up. You deserve better. You deserved a father who stayed. I'm not afraid anymore. The cold has that mercy. Past a certain point, you just get sleepy, peaceful, ready. If there's a heaven, I'll look for your mother there. Tell her I kept my promise. I didn't abandon my post. I love you, Kleine Brunhilde. Always. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, 7th Panzer Division. He closed the journal and set it on the commander's seat, positioning it where someone might find it eventually. His hand moved to the gear shift, gripping it the way he'd gripped it 1,000 times, muscle memory persisting beyond purpose. Sleep came, gentle and irresistible. Temperature inside the tank dropped another 5 degrees. Weber's breathing slowed, each inhalation shallower than the last, until it stopped entirely. He froze in position, hand on gear shift, eyes open but unseeing, body becoming one with the metal that surrounded him. Outside, Soviet patrols reported a lone Panzer IV sitting immobile near the road. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, expecting resistance. Found none. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov climbed onto the hull, peered through the open hatch, and saw the frozen tableau inside. He read the journal, his German adequate for translating the final words, and stood silent for a long moment. Then he gave orders. Leave him. This man earned his rest. No looting. Mark this position. When the war ends, someone should know where he died. His men obeyed, uncomfortable with showing respect to the enemy, but understanding why it mattered. Some deaths transcended politics. Some sacrifices demanded acknowledgement regardless of whose flag you served. The Wehrmacht's armored strength, once measured in hundreds of operational tanks, had shrunk to double digits. Across Army Group Center, crews reported identical problems: frozen oil, cracked blocks, dead batteries, tracks that wouldn't move, turrets that wouldn't traverse, guns that couldn't fire. The panzer divisions existed on paper, present in unit rosters and tactical maps, absent from the battlefield in any meaningful capacity. 11.8% operational. The rest were monuments to hubris and failed logistics, scattered across the Russian steppe like modernist sculptures in a gallery of military futility. While the Wehrmacht fought its losing battle against machinery and temperature, the Red Army emerged from positions that had seemed empty, materialized from snow and forest, and the vast expanse that had swallowed German momentum. They weren't just surviving winter. They were part of it, moving through the cold with the ease of predators in their natural environment. The soldiers came on skis, wide planks that distributed weight across snow instead of sinking through it. Short men, stocky, with the build evolution designs for cold climates, high-calorie burn metabolisms, and compact frames that conserved heat. They wore telegraiki, quilted jackets that trapped warm air in layers. Valenki boots of felt that insulated better than leather ever could. Fur hoods that covered everything except eyes that had learned to see through Siberian blizzards. They carried PPS-41 submachine guns, drums loaded with 71 rounds, reliable in conditions that turned German weapons into clubs. Finnish puukko knives hung at their waists, blades that held an edge in cold that made German steel brittle. They moved in silence, no shouting, no war cries, just the soft whisper of skis across snow and the rhythmic breathing of men who knew exactly where they belonged. From Yakutsk, from Chukotka, from places where winter lasted 8 months and summer was a rumor. These were the Siberian divisions, men for whom minus 40 degrees constituted normal, bearable, survivable. What killed Germans was simply weather to them. The attack on Klin began at 0500, December 7th, darkness absolute and temperature hovering at minus 45 Celsius. The 98th Infantry Division, already reduced to 60% strength by cold casualties, held positions they dug with pickaxes in ground frozen hard as concrete. 850 men against what reconnaissance estimated as 2,000 Soviets. But numbers lied when one side could barely stand and the other moved with winter's blessing. The ski troops came first, white phantoms appearing 40 meters out, just shapes against slightly darker white. Motion detected more than seen. Their first volleys cut through the German lines with surgical precision, bullets finding gaps between inadequate cover, hitting men who couldn't maneuver in knee-deep snow. Soldiers fumbled with weapons, fingers too numb to feel triggers. Bolts frozen despite the urine they'd poured into mechanisms at midnight. The Karabiner 98K, pride of German infantry, jammed on the first round. Men worked bolts frantically, hands tearing skin on frozen metal, desperation overcoming pain that nerve endings could no longer accurately report. Behind the skiers came regular infantry, marching in formation through snow that barely slowed them, each man knowing exactly where to step, how to breathe, how to exist in cold that shouldn't permit human life. They wore thick coats, proper boots, equipment designed for the environment instead of adapted in panic. This was their land, their winter, their war. Soviet artillery began its work, Katyusha rockets screaming overhead, the sound terrifying even to men who'd heard every instrument in the orchestra of death. Explosions walked through German positions, each detonation throwing up geysers of white mixed with black earth and red tissue, abstract art painted in organic materials. German artillery tried to respond. Frozen mechanisms resisted. Gun crews worked with hands wrapped in rags, trying to load shells into breeches that had contracted in the cold. Clearances reduced to zero, metal refusing to accept metal. Some guns fired one round, some fired none. The Soviets, with equipment that functioned in conditions it was designed for, fired continuously. Then came the T-34s, appearing through morning mist like prehistoric beasts, exhaust steam rising from vents, engines purring with the confidence of proper winter oil and antifreeze that actually prevented freezing. Wide tracks distributed weight that let them cross snow German panzers couldn't navigate. Sloped armor deflected rounds from German anti-tank guns, the few that still function. Each T-34 shot produced a flower of fire against the white landscape. A German position transformed into crematorium, metal fragments and burning flesh marking where defenses had been. Crews who tried to flee found themselves machine-gunned while running or collapsed in the snow, exhaustion and cold catching them before Soviet bullets could. The 98th Infantry Division broke after 90 minutes, unit cohesion dissolving into individual survival instinct, men running in whatever direction offered hope of escape. Most ran toward the rear, some ran toward the Soviets, arms raised, shouting words they hoped meant surrender. A few just stopped, sat down in the snow, and waited for whatever came next. Hartmann watched from 300 meters away, his unit held in reserve, powerless to intervene. He counted muzzle flashes, estimated casualties, and knew mathematics. 850 men defending, perhaps 200 escaping. The rest were becoming part of the landscape, bodies that would freeze in position and remain until spring or later, depending on how thoroughly snow covered them. Beside him, Peter shook, from cold or fear or both, the distinction meaningless when both produce the same physiological response. They're not even slowing down. They're just crushing everything. Hartmann nodded, had no words that would make the observation less true. The Soviets weren't fighting. They were executing, methodical as butchers processing livestock, efficient and emotionless and unstoppable. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov led his ski unit through the aftermath, passing bodies frozen in running positions, faces locked in expressions that would remain until decomposition or scavengers erased them. 29 years old, a history teacher before the war, he joined to avenge his brother Ivan, killed at Smolensk by Germans who'd probably died themselves by now, revenge eating itself in circular consumption. He'd written in his diary at 4 that morning, before the attack, words that expressed doubt his commissar would call treasonous if discovered. We attack at dawn. The commissar gave a speech about fascist invaders and righteous fury. The men cheered. I cheered too. But I don't feel righteous. I feel like an executioner. Yesterday I watched them through binoculars. Germans, trying to start fires with newspapers, cutting off their own blackened fingers. One was crying, hugging himself, rocking back and forth. He looked like Ivan. Same age, same build, same lost expression. Is this revenge? Killing frozen boys who can barely hold rifles? The commissar says they invaded us, burned our villages, murdered our civilians. He's right. But that crying boy wasn't at Kiev or Minsk. He was probably in school when this war started, drafted, ordered here, like me. I thought killing them would honor Ivan, but Ivan was a teacher. He taught children to question, to think, to see enemies as human. Would he want me becoming what I hate? The attack succeeded within parameters that looked impressive in reports filed with higher command. 640 German casualties out of 850 engaged, 75%, a decisive victory by any tactical measure. Soviet casualties officially reported as 80, a ratio that proved superiority in training, equipment, morale, and divine favor according to propagandists already composing narratives for Pravda. Volkov walked through the killing field, looking at faces, and saw the cost that statistics obscured. That crying German he'd noticed yesterday lay frozen in a shell crater, hands still pressed against his face, the posture of someone trying to hide from reality until reality found him anyway. They found 40 men frozen in a circle, arms linked, attempting to share warmth that none possessed sufficiently to preserve life. The commissar nodded approval. Good. Fascists dead. Volkov stared at the circle and saw something else. Brotherhood, desperation, humans facing extinction together rather than alone. One German still breathed, barely more biological reflex than conscious existence. Both legs black with gangrene, tissue dead to mid-thigh, system shutting down in stages. He saw the Soviet soldiers approaching and managed words in broken Russian. Pожалуйста, kill me, pожалуйста. Young Private Alexei, 18 and on his third day of combat, looked at Volkov with the question obvious in his expression. What do we do, Lieutenant? Volkov felt the weight of it, this choice that would define something essential about his character. The German was dying already, Leaving him would mean hours or days of suffering that served no purpose except to prove the universe's indifference to human preference. Shooting him was mercy disguised as murder, or murder disguised as mercy, the distinction semantic when the bullet performed identical function regardless of motivation. I can't, Alexei whispered, understanding what Volkov hadn't said aloud. I'm not an executioner. Neither am I, Volkov replied, the words automatic, defense against the action he knew had to follow. Sergeant Grigory, 45 years old and veteran of the Finnish War, took Volkov's pistol without asking permission. He knelt beside the German, whose eyes focused with final clarity, recognition passing between soldier and soldier that transcended flags and politics, and the causes men invoked to justify what they did. Danke, the German whispered, then added one more word. Mama. Grigory fired once, the shot echoing across snow that absorbed sound the way it absorbed heat and hope, and the boundaries between moral categories. He stood, returned the pistol, and spoke words that would haunt Volkov for decades. This is mercy, not murder. You'll understand when you're older. The commissar approached, broad face showing satisfaction inappropriate to the carnage surrounding them. Soft, Lieutenant, you're too soft. This is why we need hard men. The weak don't survive wars. Grigory stepped between them, protecting Volkov from criticism the way sergeants protect lieutenants when authority structures require defense. The boy's not soft, Comrade Commissar. He's human. There's a difference. That night, Volkov wrote by candlelight in a dugout that smelled of earth and unwashed bodies and the peculiar staleness that accumulates where men live underground. December 7th, 1941. 2000 hours. Today I killed 7 men, maybe more. Hard to count in chaos. One was a German officer organizing retreat, trying to save his men. He reminded me of Ivan. Same leadership quality, same desperate courage. I killed him anyway. Followed orders. Did my duty. We found 40 frozen in a circle, arms linked. One still breathing, begging to die. Sergeant Grigory did what I couldn't. Mercy kill. I keep thinking about that phrase. Mercy kill. 2 words that shouldn't go together, but describe something real. That German called for his mother at the end. Just like Ivan probably did. Commissar called me soft. Maybe I am. But I keep thinking, what if roles reversed? What if Ivan frozen, begging Soviet enemy for mercy? Would I want them to shoot him quick or let him suffer? I think I'd want quick, clean, merciful. We're winning. Moscow is saved. Motherland defending itself. Righteous war. So why do I feel like committing sins? Sergeant Grigory said wars make you do things that haunt you forever. But someone has to do them. Better men who feel guilt than men who feel nothing. I'll carry this guilt until I die. That German officer's face. That boy calling for mama. Is it worth it? Trading your soul for your country? Ask me when the war ends, if I survive. December 8th arrived with temperatures that continued their assault on human endurance. Minus 42 Celsius at midday, rising briefly before plunging again as darkness fell. The Wehrmacht, receiving reports of losses that couldn't be sustained, requested permission to conduct tactical withdrawal, consolidate positions, shorten supply lines that had stretched beyond breaking. Permission denied. Hitler's order came through channels, each transmission adding emphasis until the message arrived at the front with the force of divine commandment. No retreat, not one step back. Every position will be held or every man will die holding it. The Führer forbids withdrawal. Officers read the order with expressions ranging from disbelief to resignation. Some understood the logic, or tried to. Retreat in winter meant rout, discipline dissolving as survival instinct overrode training. Perhaps standing fast, despite the cost, was militarily sound. Others saw it differently, saw soldiers being sacrificed to preserve one man's pride, resources squandered to avoid admitting error, lives burned as fuel for political fiction. But military culture didn't permit open disagreement, so the order flowed downward, reaching sergeants and corporals and privates who would implement it with their bodies. Hartmann heard it from Lieutenant Schaefer, whose voice carried undertones that rank wouldn't allow articulation. We hold, no matter what. Those are the orders. Hold with what? Hartmann asked, not quite insubordinate. merely requesting clarification of impossible directive. With whatever we have. Schaefer's face showed the strain of commanding men he was sending to certain death. Make them count the cost. Make every meter expensive. Make them bleed for it even if we can't stop them. That afternoon brought unexpected success, brief as summer and twice as precious. The 12th Panzer Division, with a handful of operational tanks and desperate infantry, caught a Soviet supply column moving carelessly through a narrow defile. The attack achieved complete surprise, destroying 15 trucks, capturing 200 prisoners, seizing an ammunition depot that had somehow reached the front intact. For 3 hours, the Wehrmacht remembered what victory felt like. Men ate Soviet rations, black bread and buckwheat that tasted like salvation compared to their own dwindling supplies. They wore captured coats, Russian winter gear that actually insulated. They laughed, told jokes, sang songs they'd abandoned weeks ago when humor died along with hope. Hartmann's unit participated, now down to 12 men from the original 64. Each lost a name and face he'd carry forever. Peter, still miraculously alive, though missing 3 fingers from his right hand to frostbite, grinned with the wild enthusiasm only 18-year-olds can muster after brushing death. "See, Sergeant? We're winning. We can still fight." Hartmann allowed himself the smallest smile, tempering the boy's optimism with experienced caution. "It's one battle, kid. Don't confuse tactical success with strategic victory." But even Hartmann felt it. The seductive whisper that maybe they could survive this. Maybe there was a path through the winter that didn't end in frozen death. They'd just proven German soldiers could still outfight Soviets when circumstances aligned properly. Perhaps holding positions was possible. Perhaps the worst had passed. The illusion lasted until 1800 hours when radio reports arrived. Soviet counterattack forming, 3 divisions, tank support. All gains must be abandoned. Retreat immediately. The order contradicted the standfast directive by hours. Proof that chaos reigned at command level, decisions made and reversed and made again, as officers improvised responses to situations no doctrine covered. But the practical effect was simple. They had to abandon warmth, abandon food, abandon the brief moment of control, and return to being hunted refugees. Worse, the Soviets knew their supplies had been taken. The pursuit would be personal now, angry, determined to exact payment for the humiliation. Every captured coat would be purchased in blood. Every eaten ration would cost lives. The 3-hour victory had generated a debt that would take days to pay. Peter's face fell, joy evaporating. "But we won." "No," Hartmann corrected, voice gentle but unyielding. "We delayed losing." There's a difference. The retreat from the counterattack position cost 40% of the attacking force, men caught in the open when Soviet artillery found them, or run down by T-34s that moved faster across snow than exhausted infantry could run, or simply abandoned because they couldn't keep pace, and stopping meant everyone died instead of just the slow. By nightfall, the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond the morning's position. They'd exchanged temporary advantage for permanent disadvantage, the arithmetic of combat turning negative faster than courage could compensate. December 9th brought another massive blizzard, visibility dropping to arm's length, wind screaming across the steppe, with voices that sounded almost human if you listened long enough. Men heard names being called, companions asking for help, mothers summoning sons home. The wind distorted sound and distance, scattered real voices and created phantom ones, until distinguishing actual from imaginary became impossible. Soldiers walked away from their units, following calls that promised shelter or rescue, or simply the end of endurance. They disappeared into white nothingness, and search parties sent after them often failed to return, the lost multiplying exponentially as each attempted rescue became another casualty. Peter collapsed during the afternoon march, legs giving out suddenly, body exceeding the limits exhaustion and malnutrition and cold had imposed. Hartmann caught him before he hit the snow, held him upright through will that physics should have overruled. "Kid, get up. You don't get to quit." "Can't." Peter's voice came weak and slurred, hypothermia stealing coherence. "Too tired. Just let me rest." Hartmann looked at the 11 other men in his unit, faces showing the calculation everyone made but nobody voiced. Peter would slow them. Carrying him meant risking everyone. Leaving him meant one death instead of 12. The mathematics were obvious. The morality was impossible. Lieutenant Schaefer made it explicit. "Sergeant, we need to move. Now. We have orders to reach the reorganization point by midnight. We don't make it, we're all dead." The implicit command hung in the frozen air. "Leave him. Save the others. 1 for 11. Easy math. But Hartmann had promised to keep Peter alive. Had carried that promise since the boy joined them. Unspoken but absolute. Breaking it meant more than abandoning one soldier. It meant admitting the cold had killed something essential in himself. The part that made them men instead of animals. "He's one man," Schaefer pressed. "You have 11 others to save." Memory surfaced, unbidden. Hans saying, "We all make it or none of us do," before freezing in the night. Friedrich and Kurt dying while Hartmann survived. Weber staying with his tank while his crew escaped. Every example pointed the same direction. Sometimes the right thing was the impossible thing, but reality demanded compromise between right and possible. Hartmann knelt beside Peter, making the choice that would haunt him regardless of outcome. The morphine went into Peter's arm first, precious medicine saved for exactly this moment. Then the blanket, wrapped tight. Then the pistol, 6 bullets remaining, placed carefully in Peter's left hand, the one still functional. "If you can't take it anymore, you know what to do." Peter's eyes focused with terrible clarity. "You're leaving me." "I'm saving them," Hartmann replied. The honesty brutal because lies would be cruelty. 11 men. "I can't sacrifice them." "I understand." Peter's voice strengthened, rising from wherever reserves existed beyond exhaustion. "Actually, I do understand. They need you." "I'm slowing everyone down." "I'll come back for you," Hartmann promised, knowing the probability approached 0. "I swear it." Peter managed a smile, his face almost peaceful despite the circumstances. "Tell Greta I loved her. Tell her I was brave at the end, even if I wasn't." "You were brave," Hartmann told him, gripping the boy's shoulder. "Braver than me. You're giving us permission. That takes courage I don't have." "Go, Sergeant." Peter's final words carried unexpected authority, the 18-year-old giving orders to the 34-year-old veteran. "That's an order." Hartmann stood, turned, walked away. Didn't look back because looking back would break whatever resolve held him upright. The 11 others followed, silent, everyone processing the cost of continued existence. 50 meters away, a single gunshot cracked through the wind. Hartmann stopped, eyes closing, convinced Peter had used the pistol on himself. The guilt arrived immediately, comprehensive, permanent. He'd given the boy the means to commit suicide, facilitated it, provided the weapon and the permission and the morphine to make it easier. He kept walking because stopping wouldn't resurrect Peter or redeem the choice or change the mathematics that said 11 lives outweighed 1. The unit moved forward, each step purchased with pieces of humanity they'd never recover. Behind them, Peter remained where he'd fallen, unconscious from morphine and hypothermia. The gunshot having come from his last act of mercy, shooting a German soldier who'd been frozen nearby, still alive but beyond saving. The pistol fell from his hand as consciousness faded, and he knew nothing of the Soviet patrol that found him 2 hours later. Lieutenant Volkov approached the unconscious figure, checked for weapons, found none, and made a decision that contradicted commissar orders, but satisfied something deeper than policy. "Get him to the medic. This one lives." His men hesitated, surprised. "Why save fascists, Lieutenant?" "Because mercy travels both ways," Volkov answered, thinking of the German he'd shot at Klin, the one calling for his mother. "Tell your sergeant that. He'll understand." They carried Peter to their aid station, where a Soviet doctor worked to save enemy soldiers for reasons that made sense in the moment and would be questioned later, assuming paperwork ever reflected what actually happened in the chaos of winter war. December 10th brought the moment Wehrmacht commanders had avoided acknowledging, when resistance transformed from difficult to impossible, when the illusion of strategic coherence shattered against reality's insistence. The order arrived through command channels worded carefully to preserve dignity while authorizing retreat. Tactical repositioning, strategic consolidation, defensive realignment. Every phrase meaning the same thing. They were withdrawing. For the first time since crossing into Soviet territory, the Wehrmacht was moving backward. Not by choice, but by necessity, not according to plan, but in response to collapse. Hartmann received the news with conflicting emotions. Relief that they could finally escape the trap winter had built around them. Guilt that Peter would be left behind, marked on maps as missing presumed dead. One more name on lists that grew longer daily. Resignation that retreat merely postponed rather than prevented the final accounting. The unit moved at night, 12 men, now 11 after Peter, stumbling through snow that concealed terrain features, following compass bearings that might or might not lead to safety, hoping the reorganization point existed and wasn't just another command fiction designed to maintain order during controlled collapse. Soviet ski patrols harassed them constantly, appearing from darkness to fire short bursts before vanishing, death delivered in installments that accumulated toward bankruptcy. Every few hours someone fell, hit by bullets or exhaustion or the simple decision that continuing hurt more than stopping. The survivors kept moving because the alternative was joining the fallen. They reached the reorganization point at dawn, a cluster of buildings that had been promised as salvation, but delivered only more cold and more dying. 400 men gathered there, remnants of units that had numbered thousands weeks ago, faces showing erosion that went beyond physical damage into something metaphysical. Hartmann looked at them and saw an army broken not by enemy action, primarily, but by environment and logistics, and the cascading failure of systems designed for different circumstances. They'd been defeated by supply lines that couldn't function, by equipment unsuited to conditions, by temperature that rendered training and tactics irrelevant, by distance that swallowed reinforcements before they could arrive. A young private approached, eyes haunted, voice cracking. "Sergeant, do you think we'll make it home?" Hartmann had no answer that combined honesty with hope. "Some of us will." The kid nodded, accepting what the words implied. Walked away. Later that day, walked into the forest. Never returned. The count dropped to 10. The white abyss was patient. It took its time. It took its due. And it never stopped collecting. December 10th evening, the retreat order transformed military movement into something closer to migration, units fragmenting as they pulled back from positions that had become traps rather than defenses. Hartmann led his 10 remaining men through snow that had accumulated to thigh depth in the deeper drifts, each step requiring lift and plant and balance. The rhythm exhausting muscles already depleted by weeks of malnutrition and cold. No safe road existed. The maps showed routes that snow had erased, landmarks that white uniformity had swallowed, reference points that might as well have been fictional for all the guidance they provided. Officers consulted compasses and dead reckoning, making educated guesses about direction, while hoping educated guesses would prove sufficient to avoid marching in circles until exhaustion claimed everyone. The Soviets pursued without haste, confident as wolves tracking wounded prey, applying pressure that prevented rest without committing to decisive engagement. Better to let winter and exhaustion do the work while conserving their own strength for the final collapse. Hartmann heard them before seeing them, the peculiar whisper of skis across snow, a sound that triggered visceral fear in every German who'd survived contact with Siberian units. White shapes materialized at 300 meters, fired disciplined bursts, vanished before return fire could be organized. 3 men fell in the first encounter. 7 remained standing. They couldn't stop to render aid or recover bodies. The Soviet tactics demanded constant movement, punishing any unit that allowed itself to become stationary. Wounded men understood the mathematics. Those who could walk did. Those who couldn't received morphine if supplies remained, apologies if they didn't, and were left to whatever mercy the universe might provide. The night brought fresh horror, temperatures plunging to -44 Celsius, wind stripping away what little warmth bodies generated through metabolism and motion. Men marched in stupor, consciousness narrowing to the single imperative of placing one foot ahead of the other, everything else becoming noise their brains lacked energy to process. Some wandered off course, following paths that existed only in hypothermic hallucination, convinced they saw lights or shelter or familiar landmarks from home. Their bodies would be found months later when snow melted, frozen in walking positions that suggested they'd simply continued marching until biology quit. Legs locked mid-stride, faces set in expressions of determination or confusion, or the blank absence that comes when the mind surrenders before the body does. December 11th brought Soviet artillery, shells landing in patterns that herded German units toward prepared killing zones where machine guns waited with interlocking fields of fire. The tactics were ancient, basic, effective against an enemy too exhausted to recognize the trap until already committed. Hartmann saw it developing, patterns emerging through the chaos that training recognized even when cognition struggled. They're boxing us, trying to push us into the river valley. His men looked at him with faces too tired for proper fear, emotional reserves depleted along with physical ones. What do we do? Hartmann considered options that ranged from bad to catastrophic. Break east, away from where they want us. Terrain's worse, but maybe the Soviets won't follow. They broke formation, 7 men scattering across snow, becoming individual targets instead of a concentrated group, gambling that dispersal would confuse the pursuit enough to create gaps. The gamble paid partially. 4 made it through, 3 didn't, cut down by snipers who'd anticipated exactly this response and positioned accordingly. The 4 survivors regrouped at a burned-out ISPA, walls still standing, but roof collapsed, offering minimal cover from wind if not from observation. They huddled together, sharing body heat that none possessed sufficiently, and Hartmann conducted inventory. 4 men from an original 64. 94% casualties. The unit existed in name only, functionally destroyed. 4 individuals who happened to share history and therefore clung together through instinct rather than doctrine. "We can't keep going like this," one said, a corporal named Schmidt whose face had aged decades and weeks. "We're dead, just haven't fallen yet." Hartmann had no argument that refuted the observation. They were dead, functionally if not technically, surviving on momentum that would inevitably expire. The question wasn't whether they'd die, but when and how, whether together or separately, whether fighting or surrendering or simply sitting down in the snow and waiting for temperature to finish what Soviet bullets had started. Movement outside interrupted the discussion. Soviet patrol, 8 men on skis, approaching the ISPA with weapons ready, having tracked them or simply swept the area systematically. Either way, the result was identical, cornered. The brief firefight lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Schmidt died immediately, shot through the chest while trying to bring his rifle to shoulder. The other 2 fell wounded, one screaming until a second shot silenced him, the other quiet, shock preventing the neural signals that would have generated appropriate response to catastrophic trauma. Hartmann's rifle jammed after 1 round, the bolt frozen despite every precaution. He tried to work it free, fingers too numb to feel what they touched, watching Soviet soldiers close the distance with the calm of professionals executing routine tasks. The rifle fell from his hands as someone tackled him from behind, driving him face first into snow, knee pressed between his shoulder blades, hands roughly searching for weapons. They found the pistol, took it, left him with nothing except the awareness that he'd survived when everyone under his command had not. They bound his hands with wire that cut circulation, pulled him upright, marched him at gunpoint toward Soviet lines. The other 2 wounded Germans were executed where they lay, single shots that echoed across the white expanse, efficient and emotionless as slaughterhouse work. The Soviet camp occupied a cluster of buildings that still retained roofs, remarkable luxury and landscape where most structures had been destroyed or stripped for firewood. They pushed Hartmann into a room that smelled of tobacco and unwashed bodies and the peculiar staleness of spaces where humans lived underground or in marginal shelter. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov sat behind a makeshift desk constructed from ammunition crates, studying reports by candlelight, his face showing fatigue that transcended physical exhaustion into something more existential. He looked up as Hartmann entered, recognition flickering across features that suggested they'd seen each other before, perhaps through binoculars during some earlier engagement. The commissar stood beside Volkov, a broad man with political fervor written in every gesture, the kind of true believer who'd survived purges by demonstrating ideological purity louder than competence. Make him talk, then execute him, Standard procedure. Volkov nodded, gestured for Hartmann to sit on a stool that wobbled on uneven legs. He began in German that carried university polish, grammatically correct if accented. "Why are you here?" Hartmann considered various responses, settled on the one that required least energy to articulate. Following orders. "Even knowing you'll die? Where else can I go?" Hartmann's voice came out flatter than intended, stripped of affect by exhaustion that went beyond physical into spiritual territory. "Forward means Soviet bullets. Backward means German firing squads for desertion. Here means capture. All directions lead to death. At least this one's warm." Volkov's expression shifted slightly. Something like understanding or sympathy flickering before professional detachment reasserted control. He reached across the desk, picked up an envelope that Hartmann recognized as his last letter to Anna, the one he'd been writing in increments for weeks, never finishing because finishing meant acknowledging he might not survive to send it. "You have a son, 6 years old according to this." Hartmann's jaw tightened. "That's my letter. Private property. You lost privacy rights when you invaded my country." Volkov read aloud, translating as he went. "Anna, I don't know if I'm coming home. The cold here kills as efficiently as bullets. Tell Klaus his father loved him. Tell him war isn't glory. Tell him to be better than me." The commissar interrupted. "Enough sentimentality. Make him reveal unit positions, troop strengths, then execute him." Volkov set the letter aside, pulled out a photograph, the one Hartmann carried of his son standing in their garden, 6 years old and grinning at something beyond the camera's frame. The lieutenant studied it with focus that suggested he saw something beyond the image itself. "My brother was 23 when you probably killed him. At Smolensk, back in July. He was teacher, like me. Taught children to read, to think, to question. You probably don't remember his face. Just another Soviet soldier in the thousands you've killed." Hartmann met Volkov's eyes, saw grief and anger, and the complex emotional topology that forms when ideology collides with personal loss. "Maybe I did kill him. I killed many. I don't remember their faces anymore. They blur together." Volkov's hand moved to his holster, fingers resting on the pistol grip with the casual intimacy of someone comfortable with weapons and violence. "I could kill you now, for Ivan, for justice, for all the reasons commissars approve of." "Then do it," Hartmann told him, surprised by his own indifference. "I'm already dead. You'd just be making it official." The commissar stepped forward. "Enough talk. Execute him and move on." "That's an order, Lieutenant." Volkov's hand remained on his pistol, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he asked a question that wasn't in any interrogation manual. "What did you do before the war?" Hartmann blinked, thrown by the shift. "Machinist. Worked in a factory making engine parts." "Why does it matter? It doesn't." Volkov stood, walking to the window, looking out at snow that fell with patient inevitability. "But I need to know if you're a person or just an enemy. If you're a person, killing you means something different than if you're just a uniform with a rifle." The room fell silent except for wind outside and the commissar's impatient breathing. Hartmann felt himself breaking, exhaustion and loss, and the cumulative weight of watching everyone under his command die stripping away the protective numbness that had sustained him. "I sacrificed a boy to save my unit, 18 years old. Left him in the snow because carrying him meant everyone died instead of just him." His voice cracked. "I gave him morphine and a pistol and walked away. Heard a gunshot 50 meters later. Thought he'd killed himself." "That's what I am. A man who follows evil orders and calls it duty." Volkov turned, studying Hartmann with intensity that felt like archaeology, digging through layers to find whatever remained beneath. "Does that absolve you?" "No, nothing absolves me. I know what I am. I'll carry that boy's face until I die. Won't sleep without seeing him. Won't wake without remembering. But knowing doesn't change anything. Doesn't bring him back. Doesn't make me better." The commissar's patience expired. "Lieutenant, I'm ordering you to execute this prisoner. Now." Volkov's hand finally drew the pistol, the motion smooth and practiced. He checked the chamber, verified ammunition, actions performed with the efficiency of routine. Yes, sir. Artillery exploded nearby, unrelated German shelling that had become sporadic and inaccurate as ammunition dwindled. More gesture than tactical action. The building shook, candles guttering, smoke drifting through gaps in walls. The commissar ducked reflexively, self-preservation overriding political authority. For the moment it took chaos to assert temporary dominance. Volkov moved in that moment, cutting the wire binding Hartmann's hands with a knife pulled from his belt, leaning close enough to whisper words the commissar couldn't hear over the explosion's echo. Run. East, then south. Go. Hartmann stared, not comprehending. Why? Because someone should survive this with their humanity intact. Not me. Maybe you. Volkov pressed the letter and photograph into Hartmann's hands. Your brother? My brother is dead. Killing you won't resurrect him. But letting you live might mean something. I don't know what. Maybe nothing. But it's the only choice I have that doesn't make me exactly what I'm fighting against. Another shell landed, closer, the concussion knocking loose boards from the ceiling. The commissar shouted for soldiers, for response, for someone to take control of the situation that had escaped his authorities' grasp. Hartmann ran, stumbling through doorways and corridors, emerging into snow that had become familiar enemy. His only remaining ally, the chaos that covered his escape. Behind him, Volkov's voice called orders to search for the prisoner, the words carrying just enough delay to give Hartmann the seconds he needed. He ran east as instructed, then south, putting distance between himself and capture, between mercy and the Soviet lieutenant who'd extended it for reasons that transcended military logic. The letter pressed against his chest, photograph folded inside, artifacts of a life that seemed increasingly fictional the longer this war continued. That night, writing by light too dim to see clearly, Volkov added another entry to the diary that would survive him, hidden away and discovered decades later by historians trying to understand how humans maintained ethics in circumstances designed to destroy them. December 11th, 1941. Let a prisoner escape today. German sergeant, father. Widower probably, like most of them. Commissar would execute me if he knew, but I couldn't do it. He broke down, admitted his guilt, showed more humanity than most, told me about abandoning a boy to save his unit. The guilt was destroying him from inside. I thought killing him would honor Ivan, but Ivan taught me mercy matters more than revenge. Would Ivan want me killing fathers? Taking sons from children who'll grow up wondering what happened to Papa? I don't think so. Ivan was better than that, better than me, so I let the German go. His name was Klaus Hartmann. If he survives, maybe he'll remember a Russian showed mercy. Maybe that matters. Maybe it doesn't. I've traded my soul piece by piece in this war. Today I bought a small piece back. Is one German's life worth my soul? Ask me when this ends. If it ends. If any of us survive long enough to ask questions that matter. Hartmann walked through the night, alone for the first time since deployment, solitude amplifying awareness of how thoroughly the war had consumed everyone he'd known. Peter, presumably dead by his own hand or hypothermia. Hans and Friedrich and Kurt, frozen in a circle that first terrible night. Schmidt and the others, shot during the retreat. Weber dying in his tank because honor demanded staying with metal that couldn't appreciate the sacrifice. 64 men reduced to 1. The mathematics of attrition playing out with statistical inevitability, survival the exception rather than the rule. Each breath borrowed time that probability suggested would be reclaimed soon. He reached what remained of the reorganization point at dawn, finding 380 men gathered where promises had suggested thousands. Reality falling short of official optimism by orders of magnitude. They occupied buildings and dugouts and improvised shelters, faces uniformly showing the erosion that comes from fighting enemies on multiple fronts simultaneously, cold and hunger and Soviets, and the growing certainty that high command had forgotten or abandoned them. A runner approached, young corporal with eyes that had seen too much too quickly. Sergeant Hartmann? You're listed as KIA. Records show your unit destroyed. Not quite, Hartmann replied. though the distinction between destroyed and effectively destroyed seems semantic at this point. 4 survived initially, then 1. Now just me. The corporal made notes, updating casualty lists that grew longer, while available paper grew shorter. You're assigned to Provisional Unit 17. Report to Lieutenant Baumer. We're expecting supply convoy tonight. Rescue vehicles. Evacuation orders. Hartmann felt something stir, cautious and fragile, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. Hope. When? 1800 hours. Confirmed by radio. 20 trucks, medical personnel, winter equipment, finally. We'll be out of here by morning. The news spread through their reorganization point like electricity through copper wire, men's faces brightening with the first genuine optimism they'd permitted themselves in weeks. Relief was coming, not promises or propaganda, but actual vehicles with actual capacity to remove them from this frozen hell and transport them somewhere rear area safety still existed. Preparation began immediately. Officers organized priority lists, wounded first, then frostbite cases, then those most likely to survive if given proper medical attention. Men checked equipment, discarding anything non-essential, making themselves light for travel. Someone started singing, nervous energy seeking outlet through voice, and others joined, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. Hartmann participated mechanically, following routines while keeping emotional investment minimal. He'd learned not to trust hope, having watched it die too many times to believe in its permanence. But the men around him lacked his accumulated cynicism, permitted themselves to believe rescue was hours away, and he wouldn't steal that from them by voicing doubt. 1800 hours approached with agonizing slowness. Men gathered in groups, watching the road that supposedly would deliver salvation, straining to hear engines that should announce the convoy's arrival. Temperature hovered at -38°C, bearable only by recent standards, lethal by any reasonable measure. 1830, no convoy, radio contact established. Delayed but coming. 1900, still no convoy. Radio reports mechanical issues. Definitely coming. Hold position. 2000. Radio silence. Attempts to re-establish contact met with static and empty frequencies. 2200. Officers admitted what everyone had started suspecting. The convoy wasn't coming. Had been destroyed or diverted or simply never existed except as optimistic planning that collided with logistics reality. The hope died, not dramatically, but through gradual suffocation, oxygen leaking from the balloon until only deflated membrane remained. Men who'd been animated with anticipation returned to hollow-eyed resignation, the emotional whiplash more damaging than if they'd never permitted themselves optimism. Hartmann watched a young private, barely 20, sit down in the snow and laugh, the sound carrying hysteria's edge, sanity fraying under stress it hadn't been designed to withstand. Of course the convoy isn't coming. Why would anything good happen? This is hell. We're already dead. We just haven't stopped moving yet. The lieutenant tried to restore order, voice carrying authority that circumstances had undermined. New orders. We evacuate on foot. March to secondary position 60 kilometers south. Regroup there. 60 kilometers. 380 men, most wounded or frostbitten or sick, marching through snow and Soviet patrols and cold that would kill stragglers as efficiently as enemy action. The arithmetic was transparent. Not all 380 would complete the journey, perhaps not even half. They marched at midnight, darkness absolute except for stars that offered light but no warmth, beauty but no mercy. The columns stretched and fragmented within the first hour, gaps appearing as faster men pulled ahead and slower ones fell behind, cohesion dissolving into individual survival struggles. Soviet harassment began immediately, ski patrols hitting the column's flanks, firing and vanishing, each attack claiming 2 or 3 or 5 victims, attrition compounding until the casualty list rivaled the survivor list. Hartmann walked in the middle of the formation, conserving energy, maintaining pace that exhaustion could sustain, surviving through competence that had become automatic after months of practice. Men fell around him, some from bullets, more from simple exhaustion, bodies reaching limits and ceasing function as abruptly as machines whose fuel runs dry. He passed a soldier sitting against a tree, rifle across his lap, face peaceful. Stopped to check for pulse, found none, kept walking. Later encountered two men who died holding each other, seeking comfort in final moments. Intimacy born from shared annihilation. Kept walking. The march consumed 3 days, 60 kilometers traversed in 72 hours, each hour costing lives that statistics would summarize and families would mourn. The column arrived at the secondary position with 190 men from the original 380, 50% casualties during what reports would characterize as tactical repositioning, language sanitizing slaughter into acceptable bureaucratic terminology. Hartmann survived again, somehow, defying probability through skills he'd developed and luck he couldn't explain. But survival felt less like victory and more like sentence extension, punishment deferred rather than avoided. December 15th marked the temporary stabilization of German positions, Soviet advance slowing as their own supply lines stretched beyond efficient support range, winter applying its leveling pressure to both sides. The immediate crisis passed, replaced by chronic emergency that would persist until spring permitted conditions under which actual warfare could resume. For Hartmann, stabilization meant assignment to recovery details, units tasked with locating and identifying bodies that snow had buried during the retreat. Grim work, emotionally devastating, necessary for maintaining records and providing closure to families who'd eventually received notifications about sons and husbands, and fathers who'd died in snow rather than glory. They worked in teams, probing drifts with poles, excavating when they found resistance that suggested human remains rather than rocks or logs. What they discovered varied in preservation state depending on how long the body had been frozen, how much snow had insulated it, whether scavengers had found it before the recovery teams. Some looked almost alive, frozen so quickly that cellular damage remained minimal, faces peaceful as if sleeping. Others showed trauma's marks, wounds visible even through ice. Death, having been violent before cold, made it permanent. A few had decomposed partially before freezing, creating grotesque hybrid states between flesh and rot and ice. Hartmann found Hans from his original unit, the Berliner who'd talked about his daughter Sophie, the one who'd shared the last cigarette that night before everything ended. Hans sat against the same pine tree where he died, photo of Sophie still clutched in frozen fingers, the image preserved even though the man holding it had become sculpture. They excavated him carefully, recorded his identity, removed personal effects for eventual transmission to family. Hartmann took the photo, added it to the collection he'd accumulated, artifacts of men who died under his command or in his presence, evidence that they'd existed even if the war erased them from active participation in history. Each recovery added weight, psychological burden compounding until Hartmann moved through days in fugue state, present but disconnected, performing tasks mechanically while consciousness retreated to interior spaces where grief and guilt resided too densely to permit other emotions. Winter deepened through January and into February, temperatures remaining lethal, snow accumulating to depths that made movement nearly impossible. The war entered suspended animation. Both sides hunkered down waiting for conditions that would allow resumption of killing at scale rather than the individual murders that cold facilitated. Hartmann survived, kept breathing, maintained biological function, but something essential had died along with everyone else. Capacity for hope or joy or connection severed by relentless exposure to death and suffering. He existed. Survival meant less than it should have. Continuation without purpose. Breathing because stopping required more effort than continuing. Spring arrived reluctantly in April 1942. Temperature rising above freezing for sustained periods. Snow beginning its slow dissolution into mud and memory. As white blankets receded, they revealed what they'd hidden. Battlefield archaeology exposing winter's harvest. The recovery teams worked overtime, finding bodies daily, sometimes hourly, corpses appearing from melting drifts like dark flowers blooming in reverse. The scale exceeded all estimates. Tens of thousands frozen and buried and forgotten, now demanding acknowledgement as physics reversed winter's preservation. Hartmann worked these details mechanically, had become efficient at death processing, identifying bodies and recording information, and moving to the next discovery, without pause for reflection that would break whatever remained of his psychological integrity. April 23rd brought him to a sector near where he'd left Peter, coordinates approximate but recognizable from landmarks that snow had obscured but thaw had restored. He expected to find the boy's body, hoped to recover it personally, grant it whatever dignity burial could provide months delayed. Instead, he encountered a Red Cross official, German, carrying lists and files, and the bureaucratic apparatus that tracks soldiers through life and death in the administrative spaces between. Sergeant Klaus Hartmann? Yes, Hartmann confirmed, wondering what administrative error required correction, what paperwork needed his signature. You're listed as emergency contact for Private Peter Miller, 106th Infantry Division. Hartmann's chest constricted, breathing becoming difficult as memory supplied images of Peter sitting in snow, morphine taking effect. The gunshot that Hartmann had interpreted as suicide was. Peter's dead. I was there when it happened. The official consulted his paperwork, expressions shifting through confusion towards something that might have been satisfaction at correcting records. No, sir, he's alive. The words made no sense, language failing to convey meaning that contradicted established reality. Hartmann had heard the gunshot, had assumed Peter used the pistol on himself, had carried that guilt for months. What? Private Miller was recovered by Soviet patrol December 9th, treated as POW. Prisoner exchange occurred January 20th. Currently hospitalized in Hamburg. Status is stable, recovering. Lost 4 fingers, but expected to survive. Hartmann sat down abruptly, legs losing capacity to support weight as implications castled through consciousness. Peter alive. The guilt unnecessary. The sacrifice that had haunted him for months based on false assumption, incomplete information, the fog of war obscuring truth until bureaucracy could establish fact. I heard a gunshot. Hartmann's voice came distant, processing aloud what internal monologue couldn't resolve. 50 meters after I left him, I thought. The official shuffled papers, locating relevant details. According to Soviet records, Miller was found unconscious, hypothermic but alive. The gunshot was mercy killing of nearby German soldier. Miller had no memory of firing it, reflexive action or final act of compassion before losing consciousness. A letter, the official continued, handing over an envelope worn from handling. From Miller. He asked it be delivered to you specifically. Hartmann took it with hands that trembled, fingers struggling with the envelope's seal, pulling out pages covered in awkward left-handed writing, Peter having lost his dominant hand's functionality to frostbite. Dear Sergeant Hartmann. The words blurred as Hartmann's eyes struggled to focus through emotions he'd suppressed for months. They told me you think I'm dead. I'm not. Thanks to you. You saved me by leaving me. If you'd stayed, we'd both be dead. If you'd carried me, everyone would be dead. You made the right choice. I forgave you before you even left. The Soviet who found me could have left me to die. Instead, he carried me to their medic, saved my life. His name was Lieutenant Volkov. He said to tell you mercy travels both ways. He said you'd understand. I don't know what that means. But I'm writing it for you like he asked. I'm alive. Greta said yes. I proposed from hospital bed. We're getting married in June. You're invited. That's an order. Come home, Sergeant. The war took enough. Don't let it take you too. Your soldier, Peter Miller. Postscript. I still have the pistol you gave me. 6 bullets. Never used them. Kept them as a reminder that someone believed I'd survive. You were right. Hartmann read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning, new complexities in what he'd thought was simple narrative. Peter alive because Hartmann abandoned him. Volkov saving Peter after letting Hartmann go. Mercy traveling both ways, circulating through the war's brutality like antibodies fighting infection, insufficient to cure but preventing total moral collapse. The guilt remained, would remain permanently, but its nature had transformed. No longer simple remorse over causing death. Now something more complex, survivor's burden combined with recognition that right choices sometimes feel wrong, that outcomes diverge from intentions in ways neither planning nor hindsight can fully control. He'd saved Peter by leaving him, 11 others by making that choice. But Hans and Friedrich and Kurt had died despite his efforts. Weber had died from honor. Schmidt and the others had died during retreat. 64 men reduced to scattered survivors, each death a name and face he'd carry forever. Was it worth it? 55 dead for 9 alive? The arithmetic resisted ethical evaluation, numbers insufficient to contain the complexity of human value and sacrifice, and the impossible calculations war demanded. Hartmann stood in melting snow, letter clutched against his chest, surrounded by bodies emerging from winter's preservation, and tried to process what survival meant when so many hadn't. Spring's sun warmed his face, first genuine warmth he'd felt in months, and he closed his eyes, seeing Peter's face, young and alive and grinning at Greta's acceptance. Seeing Volkov's face, enemy turned savior for reasons ideology couldn't explain. Seeing Hans and Friedrich and Kurt, frozen together, dead but not forgotten. The White Abyss had taken 55 of his men, but Peter survived. That had to mean something, had to justify the choices made, the sacrifices required, the guilt that would persist regardless of justification. He walked away from the recovery site, leaving others to continue excavation, needing distance from death's physical manifestations to process life's unexpected persistence. Behind him, white snow continued its retreat, revealing more bodies, more stories, more evidence of winter's dominion over human ambition. Hartmann reached a memorial that someone had erected, simple wooden crosses marking mass graves, names carved where identification had been possible, blank where it hadn't. He added Hans's photo to the collection at the memorial's base, placing it carefully among others, small shrine to men who died for causes that seemed increasingly abstract the longer he survived. 55 crosses. He could see them in his mind even without physical markers, each representing someone who'd followed orders and paid the ultimate price, whose families would receive notifications and never fully understand what their sons and husbands and fathers had experienced before dying. They died for each other more than for Germany. That was the truth bureaucracy wouldn't acknowledge. Died trying to keep companions alive. Died from cold while sharing blankets. Died from exposure while standing watch so others could sleep. Died because war places people in impossible situations and demands they choose between bad options and worse ones. The White Abyss never forgave, never released those it claimed. But sometimes, rarely, it permitted someone to walk away, to carry memory back into the world of the living, to testify that horror had occurred and consumed most but not all. Hartmann was walking away, not because he deserved it, not because he'd earned it, but because Volkov had chosen mercy, because Peter had survived, because sometimes, for reasons that defied logic, chance favored individuals in ways that mocked probability. He pulled out the letter again, reading Peter's words about the wedding, the invitation, the order to come home. The boy who'd needed protecting had become the man giving orders. Reversal completing some symmetry that war had initiated. Hartmann would go, would attend the wedding, would meet Greta and see Peter's life continue despite everything that had tried to end it. Would carry Hans's photo and Friedrich's letters and Kurt's philosophy notes and Weber's journal and all the small artifacts he'd collected from the dead. Would carry their memories because someone had to. Because forgetting would be worse than remembering. Because the only victory worth claiming was the refusal to let suffering become meaningless. To insist that each death mattered even when the war suggested otherwise. That night in a rear area barracks where heat existed and food came regularly and danger consisted of bombs rather than cold, Hartmann wrote his own letter, words coming slowly but with conviction that months of suffering had crystallized. Dear Anna and Klaus, I'm coming home. Not the man who left. That man died in the snow. But someone survives. Someone who's seen what happens when nations decide human lives are acceptable currency for political objectives. I'll tell you everything. You deserve to know. Klaus deserves to know what war actually means, stripped of propaganda and glory, reduced to cold and hunger, and watching friends die while being powerless to prevent it. I commanded 64 men, 9 survived, scattered across hospitals and reassignments and the gaps between official records. The rest are buried under Russian snow, some in marked graves, most not. Their families receiving notifications that obscure how they actually died. Peter Miller lives. You remember him? The kid from Hamburg I wrote about. I thought I'd killed him by leaving him. Turns out I saved him. The guilt remains but transforms. I did right by accident, wrong with good intentions, and the distinction matters less than I thought it would. A Soviet lieutenant let me live when he could have executed me, showed mercy for reasons I don't fully understand, said mercy travels both ways. He's right. It does. Through enemy lines, through winter, through the space between what we're ordered to do and what we choose to do when orders conflict with conscience. 55 men gave their lives, not for Hitler, not for Germany, for each other. Because when everything else fails, human connection persists. They died trying to keep each other warm, trying to keep each other alive, trying to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to destroy it. That's the only victory we won, the only one worth having. I'll be home soon. Hold me when I arrive. I'll be cold for a long time. The winter got inside, deeper than bones, into whatever part of us remembers warmth and safety, and the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. I love you both. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I survived when better men didn't. I'm sorry for what this war made me do, and made me witness, and made me become. But I'm coming home, and I'll spend whatever life remains trying to honor the men who can't. Klaus. He sealed the letter, addressed it, gave it to postal services that would carry it west toward home and family and the life that waited beyond war's immediate grasp. Then he lay down on an actual mattress in a heated room and tried to sleep, knowing nightmares would come. Accepting them as the price of consciousness. The tax survivors paid for outliving their companions. The white abyss spoke in his dreams, voice composed of wind and cold and the absence of warmth. It recited names, all 64, perfect roll call of men who'd served under his command. Hans, Friedrich, Kurt, Schmidt, endless litany of the dead demanding acknowledgement. He woke before dawn, lay in darkness reviewing what survival meant. Peter alive, marrying Greta, building life beyond war's reach. Volkov choosing mercy despite ideology's demands. Weber dying with honor, intact. Hans and Friedrich and Kurt frozen together, brotherhood persisting past biology's surrender. The war had taken 55 of his men, but it couldn't take their humanity. Couldn't erase the moments of kindness and sacrifice and connection that had persisted despite everything designed to destroy such qualities. Weber died with his tank, but his honor remained. Peter lost fingers, but gained lifetime. Volkov let an enemy go and saved his own soul. Hartmann survived and would carry everyone else forward through memory and testimony. The white abyss was patient. The white abyss was eternal. The white abyss never forgave. But sometimes, just sometimes, it released someone. Not because they deserved it, but because someone else decided enough death for today. That was the real story. Not about those who died. About those who lived and what they carried home with them. The dead rested in snow. The living carried snow in their hearts, forever. June arrived with summer's warmth. Germany impossibly green after months of Russian white. Life persisting despite war's attempts at universal consumption. Hartmann attended Peter's wedding, stood among guests who hadn't experienced what he and Peter shared. Watched the boy who'd survived become a man choosing future over past. Peter approached afterward, left hand extended in greeting, right hand's absence visible but not defining. You came. I was ordered, Hartmann reminded him, managing something close to a smile. Can't disobey direct commands? They stood together, two survivors among the living, carrying weight invisible to everyone else, connected by suffering that transcended explanation. Peter's fiancée, now wife, approached radiant in white, innocence that war hadn't touched, future unshadowed by past. This is Greta. Peter's voice carried pride and protective love. Greta, this is Sergeant Hartmann, the man who saved me. Greta extended her hand, gratitude evident in expression and posture. Thank you for bringing him home. Hartmann took her hand gently, aware of the half-truth they believed, the full story too complex for wedding celebration. he saved himself. I just gave him the opportunity. Later, alone for a moment, Peter asked the question Hartmann had expected. Do you think about them? The others? Every day. Hartmann watched dancers celebrating life, temporary victory over death's inevitability. Every night. They're always there. Does it get easier? Hartmann considered lying, offering comfort that experience contradicted. No, but you learn to carry it. Learn to live with weight that never decreases. And sometimes, watching you with Greta, knowing you survived and built this life, that helps. Makes the weight mean something. I have the pistol still, Peter confessed. 6 bullets, like you gave me. I look at it sometimes, remember that night, remember thinking I'd die there. And then I remember someone believed I'd survive. That matters more than you know. The wedding continued, celebration persisting despite history's shadows, life asserting itself against death's claims. Hartmann stayed until propriety allowed departure, then walked into evening air that smelled of flowers instead of death, heard birdsong instead of artillery, felt warmth instead of cold that never entirely left his bones. The white abyss remained in Russia, snow-covered and patient, waiting for next winter's victims. But its reach extended beyond geography, into memory and dreams, and the space between who soldiers were before war and who they became after. Hartmann carried it with him, would carry it until his own death, however and whenever that arrived. Carried Hans's smile and Friedrich's wheatfields and Kurt's philosophy, and Weber's honor, and all 55 men who died so 9 could live. Carried Volkov's mercy, enemy turned savior, proof that humanity persisted even when circumstances demanded its suppression. Carried Peter's survival, walking proof that impossible choices sometimes produced right outcomes through paths nobody could have predicted. The white abyss took most of them, but it couldn't take everything. Couldn't erase love or sacrifice or the stubborn human insistence that meaning exists even in meaninglessness, that dignity persists even when everything conspires to destroy it. That was the victory, not territorial or strategic, not measurable in kilometers or casualties, but human, individual, the refusal to let horror have the final word. Hartmann walked home through summer evening, warm and alive and haunted, carrying winter in his heart where it would remain forever, permanent reminder of the price survival demanded and the debt he owed to those who'd paid it. The white abyss never forgave, but sometimes mercy traveled both ways, and sometimes that was enough.